I'd like to thank you for coming out tonight. My name is David Nitkin. I'm going to be your moderator for the next hour and a half. What I want to do is to explain a few ground rules to you so that we can make as much effective time as possible in tonight's program. So the first ground rule is that we are asking, when we come time for questions, that you make it clear whether you are asking a question or making a comment. The second ground rule is that whether or not it is a question or a comment, and it can't be both, you have 3 sentences. If we're going to have this an effective learning experience, we want you to be very careful and thoughtful in your questions or comments. So the first ground rule is you may ask a question or a comment. It is to be 3 sentences at most long. That's the first ground rule. The second ground rule is we're going to be operating according to a pretty tight timeline tonight. Tom Quiggin, who I'll be introducing momentarily, will be talking for about 10 or 12 minutes to basically tell you what it is that he is doing and what are his professional observations on Islamicist extremism here in Toronto and in Canada. We will then be following up with a number of questions that we will be asking of Tom in the first roughly 30 or 35 minutes. Then we are going to open up the floor to questions from you, comments from Rabbi Grover, and from myself. Rabbi Grover has a number of observations to make about the character of religious tolerance and the positive message that Tom is bringing to us tonight. So this is not a bad news message. In my case, one of the organizations that I'm responsible for is StopSponsoringHatred.com. And we have, within the last 8 to 10 weeks, put together for the first time a resource database which will be made public on November the 1st. That will mean if you have a concern or a problem on campus, or in the public arena, or in the school system, or in public space, or with a fraud charity, or with threats in public or in private, there will be a new resource for the first time available that now has 19 lawyers, 1 accountant, and 6 researchers. And those numbers we hope will be added to, but those will be people that you will be able to go to online to consult, to know what your rights are, to know what you can do to change the equation. Another ground rule tonight is we are going to be respectful not only of one another, but we're also going to be respectful of religions. And so I will rule you out of order if you're going to make blasphemous comments about an entire religion. Please be aware of that fact. This is about tolerance. This is about the values we share in Canada and the values that unite us. And so while what we are going to do is to understand the challenges we face, we're doing it within a constructive, positive framework. I'm going to read the final ground rule to you because it's necessary in the current security situation. So please listen very carefully. Beth Tikva Synagogue is a private space. Each of you in attendance tonight are committed to respecting the ground rules I have just laid out as moderator. These ground rules are intended to preserve mutual respect, public safety, and prevent disturbance of the peace. If you violate these proceedings in any way, if you violate these ground rules, you will be tapped lightly on the shoulder and you will be asked to leave the room. There are 6 gentlemen that have been empowered by the synagogue to use the full force of Canadian law to not only remove you from this room, but to take you to the nearest police officer or police station. And there is a vehicle outside this room, so that if you disrupt these proceedings in any way, you're not just going to be escorted out of the room, you'll be taken to a police station. Is there anyone that can't count to 1, 2, or 3, or has a problem with any of those ground rules? I will assume that in the absence of any negative comments that you all understand the ground rules. This program is being fully recorded and taped and will be made available in public if you want to view it after the fact. So I have 2 more cosmetic details. One is to tell you that if you have to take advantage of the washroom facilities, they are out through the double set of doors. You're welcome to take advantage of those facilities. And the last would be to introduce our speaker. Tom Quiggin has been a busy fella. He appeared last night for a 2-hour meeting with a speakers advocacy group, giving them advice and guidance about what his long research will mean for their letter writing and their film and their other activist programs. He spoke today at lunch, where he met with senior bank officials, he met with senior lawyers and compliance officers on what's involved in terms of risk associated with financial institutions and accounting and law firms in handling money that has terrorism roots. He's going to be speaking later tonight, if that wasn't a busy enough agenda, with a former president of the Sinn Féin, which means that he will have to leave this room tonight at 8:45. So we will try and get as many questions as we can after we've heard him speak. So very briefly, Tom Quiggin is a national security intelligence subject matter expert and author of a very explosive 2014 study on the Muslim Brotherhood in Canada. He's a qualified court expert on terrorism in the criminal court and the federal court, as well as a court expert on the reliability of intelligence's evidence in the federal court. He was a senior fellow at the School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He has 25 years of practical risk analysis and intelligence experience in a variety of positions, including the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Bank of Canada, the Canadian Armed Forces, the United Nations Protection Force in Yugoslavia, Citizenship and Immigration Canada, War Crimes Division, the International War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and the Privy Council Office of Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Tom Quiggin.
Thank you very much, Rabbi, for the invitation and for providing the facility, and David for the overly generous introduction. I've never actually been in a room when somebody says there's going to be 19 more lawyers involved and people actually cheer. Not been my experience in the past, and I've sat in a lot of courtrooms. Let me just start by, I'll start with conclusion and say that I think Canada needs a national level inquiry to look at the effects of violent extremism and non-violent extremism and the flows that are coming into our country that bring with it this extremism. I would say this should include an inventory of the organizations, front groups, the individuals, and the money that is being used to advocate these views that run directly contrary to our Constitution and to our Charter of Rights. So when I talk about extremism and extremists, what am I talking about? Well, some of it's pretty easy. The terrorist with a bomb, okay, that one's easy. That's a violent extremist. It's the non-violent extremists that I would argue are a greater threat to our society. And I would say, well, if you're going to put a label on somebody and call them an extremist, violent or non-violent, that's quite an undertaking. To call someone an extremist that's a very serious charge in today's political atmosphere. So there have been a number of people, guys like Alex Schmidt, who wrote a paper on violent and non-violent extremism and said, look, it's two sides of the same coin. And he and myself and others have sort of worked on this issue and said, look, if you're going to call somebody a group, or you're going to call them a group and say they're an extremist group, be they violent or non-violent, you have to ask certain questions and say, look, do they believe in universal human rights, including women and people of other faith? Do they believe in equality of all before the law? Do they encourage integration, or do they encourage isolation? Are they tolerant of other belief systems in a pluralistic setting? Do they condemn terrorism? Do they condemn violence? Do they advocate rights for women? Do they accept pluralism within the interpretation of other religions itself, including Islam? And of course, we have, I believe, coming into Canada right now, I think we have three main flows of extremism coming in, brought to us by the Muslim Brotherhood, brought to us by the Khomeinists, sponsored by Iran, and brought to us by the Wahhabis, who are largely funded by the Saudi Crown. I would also suggest that we have a significant remaining problem in Canada with the pro-Khalistan movement, the folks that brought you the Air India bombing. While that movement in India has kind of largely died away, we still have the problem here in Canada and the United Kingdom, and that voice of extremism is still very strong with those folks. And ironically enough, most of the import into Canada is coming from the United Kingdom, not from India in that particular case. So I do think we have a significant problem with extremism in Canada. I do think that the non-violent extremists tend to be the most dangerous. In other words, the guy with the bomb or the gun, so like the Toronto 18s, the Moment Kawajas in Ottawa, the Via Rail plot, there's something direct and forthright about that. You can see it, you can fight it, you can challenge it. Sometimes you lose the battle, such as we did twice in Ottawa last week. But it's something that's above ground, you can see it, you can fight it, you can challenge it. Non-violent extremists, who are the people that bring you the concept of Islamophobia, who put a chill on the issue of discussion of multiculturalism, those people are actually undermining the foundation of your house while they're talking to you. And one day your house will collapse and you look around and you'll go, how'd that happen? And you'll realize that it wasn't a guy with the bomb that got you, it was a guy with the ideology that undermined your culture, your faith. Something else is happening in Canada and to America as well, but it's particularly virulent here in Canada. For those of you who've grown up and lived in Toronto, you might remember dear old Ahmed Syed Cotter, father of Ricky Cotter, father of Omar Cotter, etc., etc., etc. We all know dear old Ahmed, now deceased. He actually would counsel people in Canada and say you shouldn't commit acts of violence in Canada. And his reasoning was that Canada's not a bad place for Muslims. They're reasonably well treated. You can do fundraising, you can do recruitment, you can do training, you can do weapons training, you can buy dual-use technology, you can ship this stuff overseas, and the government, generally speaking, tends to leave you alone. But he also argued and said, look, if we do something stupid and blow something up, he says that gives the government the excuse to come down on us. So Ahmed Syed Cotter's generation, which sort of grew up in the 80s and 90s, had that kind of view that jihad and violence kind of meant over there, and over there being somewhere, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, etc. What we're seeing now, and it's very difficult to put a finger on an exact date, but you can look at 2003, 2004, 2005, you see a change in the tenor of the discussion, you see a change in the strategy, and a change in the thinking. There's an argument now that violence can be here, it can be there, it can be anywhere. So a lot of folks expressed shock at last week's events in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu and in Ottawa, but for a lot of folks we kind of looked at it and said, this has been coming for a while. Toronto 18 was the sort of indicator and warning, that was the initial signal that something was wrong in Canada, that folks who live here are advocating blowing up stuff here in Canada. The fact that those plots were deflected, etc., were good, but it sort of hid the message a bit. So now we're at a point where we're seeing that violent extremism being advocated here in Canada is also not just being advocated here, but being practiced here. And unfortunately, I think that's a trend we're looking at for a bit. One quick comment on the Middle East, and then we'll kind of move over to the Oprah phase of the discussion. If you look around the Middle East, it's not perhaps a surprise to say things are a bit tense at the moment. There's a lot of trouble there. It's also fair to say that for political scientists always argue that national boundaries are artificial to a certain degree. And in the Middle East, I would argue, they're especially artificial. If you look at the countries and the boundaries of places like Egypt, Iran, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, etc., those countries have horribly artificial boundaries. Their reasons for existence are highly questionable in some cases. But all of those boundaries are a product of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. They're a product of the collapse of colonialism in the Middle East, British, French, German, etc. They are a product of World War I and a product of World War II. As the map was redrawn, literally on paper napkins in some cases, boundaries were drawn with no respect whatsoever for the indigenous folk who live there. So if you look at Iraq as sort of the archetypical example, you've got Kurds in the north, Sunni in the middle, and Shia in the south. There is no real concept of Iraq in the mind of the people that live there, although Saddam Hussein worked very hard at driving it into them. But people still talk about Iraq now as though it somehow matters or it's somehow real, when in fact it's not. There's Sunni stand in the south, or Shia stand in the south, there's Sunni stand in the middle, and the Kurds up over here. Much the same can be said for Syria. Highly complex problem, but if anyone thinks Syria exists for real anymore and thinks it's going to come back, I would suggest it ain't going to happen. On top of all of that, and this is key to the discussion, a number of the folks who are the primary thinkers in the Muslim Brotherhood, in the Khomeiniist movement, and in the Wahhabi movement actually regard the nation state, the Westphalian state system that we regard as just normal, that to them it's a contested concept. And they believe that the nation state was a European product. They believe it was a tool of oppression, a tool of colonialism, and it was done to fragment them into small groups so they could be dominated by colonialism. So when we talk about countries as though somehow it's a natural state of existence, when they hear nation state and country, they think colonial oppression. One of the things I think that is so dangerous about ISIS that's just been formed is not just what's bad about it, which is the beheadings, the sort of genocide, the oppression of women and all that. On top of that, the physical horror of ISIS, there is something else going on. And this is the point. A number of people, Osama bin Laden, Zawahiri, Sheikh Azam, al-Madoudi, Sayyid Qutb, Hassan al-Banna, the whole crowd of them, have argued for the return of a caliphate system. And they regard the collapse of the Turkish Caliphate, or the Ottoman Caliphate in 1924, as the most horrific event in their history, when the Caliphate finally collapsed. Now this group of guys, led by al-Baghdadi, a former Muslim Brotherhood guy, have actually reestablished what they're calling a caliphate. And to a certain degree, you can say it has, I'll use the word legitimacy in a very strange kind of way, but they control the territory upon which they claim to exist. Which is one of the primary sort of discussions about whether you recognize someone or not as a state. They would be horrified that I'm calling them a state. They would call it a caliphate. But nonetheless, they have a government, they have a judicial system, if one wants to call it that. They have a financial system, they have a military, they have a police force. And for a year and a half, they've been controlling a certain amount of territory, which they've now expanded into Iraq. They have reestablished the dream of the caliphate. And I think a lot of people miss the inspiration that they are to a lot of radicals around the world. So people here in Canada who've been brought onto this conveyor belt of extremism and radicalization done by local groups, done by local effort, are now sort of looking at the message from over there going, wow, this is what we talked about, we want to be a part of that. So why are people from Calgary, Calgary, oil, cowboys, pipelines, tar sands, environmentalists, suicide bombers, ISIS fighters. Why are guys from Calgary going off to do this? City of London, Ontario is a great producer of terrorists. And you think like, London, Ontario? Really? You know, river, trees, university, hospital, really nice city, and it exports terrorists. How is it that? Well, if you look at where the extremist groups in Canada, the Brotherhood, the Khomeinists, the Wahhabi, concentrate some of their efforts, it maybe is not a surprise to me, perhaps not a coincidence, that there are large concentrations of these folks in Mississauga, London, Calgary, etc., etc. And a large number of these people have been inspired by what they see going on around them in the world, and they're choosing to go off and do it over there, and as we saw last week in Ottawa, over here. Do we want to kind of move on to the next phase here? Yes.
All right. So I've got a series of questions that I'm going to be asking Tom. At a certain point, we'll have exhausted most of the questions. We're going to do them in rather rapid fire. There will be an opportunity for you to ask a question or comment with a 3-sentence limit at either of the two microphones, and we will alternate between the microphones. Tom, the first question. You ain't Jewish. What animates you? Is Canada under threat?
I have a somewhat complicated family tree. Irish, Manx, Anglo, mostly Protestant. I have a sister who's a pastor and a part-time pastor, a nurse and a teacher. She's actually the brains of the family. But so how is it I come to do this kind of thing? The military, in its ultimate wisdom, thought that I should go to a place called Bosnia for a while in 1994, after having worked on Bosnia as an intelligence problem for a couple of years before that. And I got to go visit wonderful places like Liki Petrovo Salo, Bielonica. Ring any bells? No, probably not. The absolute dump of the planet. People killing each other in large numbers, and this is where we got to go. While I was there, I was quite taken by the place and the fact that it's stunningly beautiful. It truly is. Yugoslavia was a truly beautiful country, or at least most of it. And the people who are killing each other in large numbers speak the same language. They look the same. They eat the same food. They wear the same clothes. They drive the same food. They smoke the same cigarettes. And we're sitting there going, why y'all killing each other in large numbers and doing it so effectively and with such elan? And of course, the answer is extremism. Under Tito, he had tamped down most of the extremism and said, we will have brotherly love. We may have to kill a few people if they don't express brotherly love, but that's what we're going to have. When Tito died, unfortunately, the voices of extremism, Itzebagevich, who's a Muslim Brotherhood guy at the end of the day, started advancing his view of the world, which the Serbs and the Croats didn't like. Milosevic started advancing his view of the world, communist kind of thing, and Tudjman started espousing his view of the world, which looked a lot like unreformed fascism. And the next thing you know, they're all at it. So I was able to look up close and personal and watch what happens when extremism gets out of hand. And it's like large numbers of dead people, flat villages, rape camps. It's really ugly. 2000, I'm working for the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, and I'm told there's a no-go zone in The Hague for Dutch people. And it's no-go because it's an Algerian and Moroccan community where Dutch people are not allowed to go. And I said, what do you mean not allowed? I said, you go try it. So one fine day, being the curious boy I am, I walked into a street next to the Hollandspoor station, which is listed by them as a no-go zone. And sure enough, I got from about here to the wall up the street, and I turned around and I left. Everybody on the street stops, stares at you, everything stops. Groups of young men start to gather and move towards you, and all of a sudden you realize, you're not really from around here and you're not welcome. It's good of you to leave. So I did. 2007, I'm in the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway with the RCMP on a little thing. And we got introduced to the concept of no-go zones in large cities. So in Rotterdam, they showed us 7 no-go zones where the police won't go without planning ahead of time, without getting permission from the deputy chief or the mayor. In France right now, although I've never seen it personally, the French have listed on their Ministry of Interior website 1,100 no-go zones for police. So I got exposed to all this extremism, and then I come over here, and what do I hear? All of a sudden I'm starting to hear those voices again. The sound, the nature, the tone, the political discussion. And it's like, I don't want these guys in my country because I've seen what they've done in other people's countries.
Very clear answer. Second question. You talked about 3 forms of Islamic extremism. You've talked about the Muslim Brotherhood. You've talked about Iranian Khomeiniism. You've talked about the Saudi influence. What are those 3 different influences, and what specifically is their relationship in Canada to Hamas, Hezbollah, and ISIL?
Define truth, it's not hard. Let's see. Relationships. Okay, first off, Hamas at the end of the day is a Muslim Brotherhood organization. If you read the Hamas charter, second line of the charter says we're the Muslim Brotherhood. That part's fairly clear. A number of organizations here in Canada were designed and built to support Hamas. So, for instance, there's a charity called IRFAN, International Relief Fund for the Afflicted and Needy, which prior to 2000 was known as the Jerusalem Fund for Human Services. That was a organization which then became a charity, which was designed, built, purposely to fund Hamas. Despite being warned by the government repeatedly not to do what they were doing, they went ahead and raised money for Hamas. So if you look at what Irfan did, from I think 2004 to 2009, they raised about $14 million in cash for Hamas, about $17 million in services, like computer servers, products like that. So that's one charity the Muslim Brotherhood operates in Canada, and that's what they were doing, and that was designed specifically to support the Hamas cause. With Hezbollah, we don't see, like the Khomeinists are kind of recent arrivals on the scene. The Muslim Brotherhood was created in 1928, and then in the 1950s they sort of spread out to the rest of the world, and in 1958 they actually arrived in Canada. You can actually put an actual date on it. So they've been here on the ground since the 1960s, building and expanding. The Khomeinists, of course, only really come to the forefront in 1979 with the revolution, and then it takes them years to stabilize. Their presence in Canada really has only become egregious in 2000, 2004 kind of a thing. But before that, we have had Hezbollah. Hezbollah has had organizations here designed to raise funds, dual-use technology, military gear, moving people back and forth across the border. They have not, to my opinion, structured themselves in an organizational manner that they are going to form charities or to form lobbying groups to go after the government. Hezbollah's role here in Canada has been training, weapons, ammunition, money, that sort of thing. The Saudi Wahhabis are sort of an interesting thing in the sense that they, unlike the Brothers and unlike the Khomeinists, they don't really have the sort of structure and organization in the sense of boards of directors and buildings. But the Wahhabi presence is felt through a lot of communities. So if you want to go to one community and ask about the Wahhabis and how they feel about it, go see the Somalis in Ottawa. And most of them are really angry because if you're a Somali, I mean, you've had enough problems in your life already. You know, that kind of whole civil war thing in Somalia. You come to Canada and find out you're living in Ottawa where it's minus 35. And man, I mean, it's got to be tough to be a Somali because, you know, you're black, you're Muslim, you're newly arrived, you don't speak the language, you've got no job skills, and boy, it's a tough uphill road for those folk. And they come from a society which we'll say was a bit bent to start with. Now they look around and they go, hang on, what's happening to our community? We're getting all these radical kids either going off to being drug dealers and gangbangers, or they're going off to Mogadishu to blow stuff up. One of the answers is almost all the Somali mosques in the Ottawa area all have Wahhabi preachers now. It's not an accident. That is Wahhabi money at work.
Third question. What is Canada's experience with terror-related sham charities? Both those 4 that are closed and those that are still existing.
Yeah, one of the things I think folks tend to look at, folks have looked at me a number of times and asked me if I'm a bit odd, and I'll say, yeah, okay, probably am. Like, how do I maintain a sense of humor when I work with war crimes, conflict, serve in a war zone, and then come back and do national security stuff and terrorism sort of stuff? It's not an all bad news story. I'm a bit of a cynic in how I view the world. But at the end of the day, I'm a bit of an optimist. The human condition does improve. You know, we're getting better. At least parts of our planet are getting better. Here in Canada, where there's been a number of good things happen lately, Irfan, that charity I mentioned earlier, lost their charitable status in 2011. CIBC Bank yanked their accounts in 2013. The RCMP raided their premises this year on an evidence collecting mission, and the government declared them a terrorist entity. WICS, the World Islamic Call Society, lost its charitable status in 2012, I think it was. And the World Islamic Call Society is Muammar Gaddafi's jihad fund, as it's expressed in Canada. They were moving millions of dollars into Canada, down into the Caribbean, down into America, and for projects here like the Tariq Mosque here in Ottawa is paid for by Muammar Gaddafi. Go figure. You may have heard about the plot in New York 4 or 5 years ago where they're going to blow up the fuel supply on an airfield, paid for by a Canadian organization based in London, Ontario. Good to see we're out there making a difference. So they lost their charitable status. Here in Mississauga, there's something called the Islamic Society of North America, a very big, powerful organization in Canada and America, and they were the second major organization built here by the Brothers. They lost their charitable status for funding Jamaat Islamiyah in the Kashmir. So they got busted for funding terrorism. And so that's put a spotlight on their organization. So there's been 4 charities, Irfan, WICS, WAMI, and Irfan, whatever, have lost their status. So this is, I think, the beginning of a government effort to actually go after some of this stuff, and that's positive news. The other thing that's really good news in this is that a number of these charities, especially